lived in Germany for 3 years after the war. My dad was a rabbi, but he was a chaplain in the American Army, and so we lived over there for 3 years, and then came back to the States. And I actually grew up in. I think of myself as growing up in California, in Bakersfield, California. Yeah, I think there's several pieces. I think that I mean, one, well, several. One is just about narrative. I mean, if we're talking about narrative, I mean, I grew up in one. It's hard to grow up Jewish without growing up in a story, because that's kind of what all the holidays are about. They're all chapters in a story that you're sort of part of, and my father being a rabbi, that's sort of, there was no escape for me. I was like, and you are living, at least we were always in communities that were not majority Jewish communities, so it was always like a sense of other, but the other was connected through this story. That's kind of what gave you your identity, and so I think the interest in narrative is pretty much to that, and but then the content of it, the Passover story, because well, as a rabbi's kid, you have to go to everything, but which has issues. But the Passover, the celebration of the Passover with food. It's the Exodus story with food, and every year I really loved that story of this idea of people freeing themselves, and that's what the story is. And there's a part in the Passover where and it's focused on the kids. The whole holiday is conceived of telling the story to the children, so the children can tell the story to their children. That's how the identity is passed on. And the book that's used, the Haggadah, means story in Hebrew, and so so there's a point where they turn to the kids and say, you were slaves in Egypt. What do you mean? I've never been a slave, never been to Egypt, until getting the point that what it meant was that this story is not of really one time or place, or even one people, but it's a story that's told generation after generation. You sort of got to figure out, are you there with Pharaoh and his horses and whatever? Are you there with those people that are trying to find a land of promise for themselves? And that had a deep effect on, why I later got involved in the civil rights movement. So there's the story, the content of the story. And then Germany was, I was a small child, but my father's work was mostly with Holocaust survivors, and that's what it was then. And so people who had experienced that horror was a part of the reality in our house, even though I was really too young to grasp the extent of it. But it was people looking for hope, looking for something. And that my 5th birthday party was it was called a DP camp, displaced persons camp, but it was all children. And my mother's idea was that, well, we should have my birthday party there, and I should give gifts rather than getting them. Now, it wasn't my idea, believe me, but and I actually thought it was kind of neat that it was all kids, until I was given to understand why. Parents had all been killed. And so the Holocaust was a reality in our home, but my parents interpreted it to me not being simply about anti-Semitism, but about racism. That racism kills. Simple. It's not complicated politics, not complicated ideology. Racism kills. And so, all that sort of came together for me in getting involved in the civil rights movement, which was, of course, challenging racism in this country. It was a reenactment of the Exodus story. And that's kind of how I found my way from Harvard into the civil rights movement, which is then where I was as an organizer for like 28 years. Not civil rights, then the farm workers, electoral politics, and all the rest of it. So I'd say the story was pretty important.
Was there a particular moment for you when you were studying at Harvard in the 60s that made you decide that it was time to leave Harvard and join the movement?
Yeah, there were a couple of things that contributed. One, One was, I remember I had taken a year off after first 2 years to live in the Bay Area. I was living in Berkeley, and I went to this Pete Seeger concert. You know, Pete Seeger just died. And it's funny, it was a Pete Seeger concert in the fall of 62, or spring of 63, I guess. And it was the Longshoremen's Hall in San Francisco. And he did this medley on civil rights about how it was all young people. And it was the first time I really got that it was a movement of young people. I mean, you know, it was the freedom rides, it was the demonstrations in Birmingham. It was like, and that was really challenging because it's, well, wait a second, if I sort of share these values, how do I get off not doing anything about it? And that, of course, was his intent. And I've often thought about, the young people dimension of the civil rights movement. Walter Brueggemann is a Protestant theologian. He wrote a book called Prophetic Imagination. In there he says that prophetic vision or energy occurs at the intersection of two elements. One is criticality, which is a clear sense of the world's pain, of its hurt, coupled with hope, a sense of its possibilities. And young people come of age with a critical eye on the world they find, and almost of necessity hopeful hearts. And so for my generation, a lot of that was connected. There was an affinity between generation change and social change. That Pete Seeger concert sort of crystallized it, but then when I came back to school here, there was a woman named Dottie Zellner who worked for SNCC in the South, and she was recruiting, and so through her I began meeting the young people who've been doing this work, and I admired them tremendously. And it was, again, a sort of, how do I justify, if I share their values, what am I doing? When the Mississippi Summer Project came along, there was a very explicit role. People were being asked to go to Mississippi and work in the movement there with the intention of challenging that whole, sort of breaking through the hardcore of resistance. And, by that time it was, I don't want to say a no-brainer, but it was like, it really spoke to me that this is what I needed to do. I couldn't come up with a reason, I couldn't come up with justification for not doing it. And then, of course, my parents' reaction was, well, that's fine for somebody to do, but why don't you stay and finish school? So we had some tension around that. But no, so then when I went to Mississippi in 64, then that just opened a pathway in a whole different direction. Most successful movements require a lot of leadership, a lot of it. And what happens often is that it's almost like there's a kind of almost a public need to say, oh, this person. And yes, there are certainly people more gifted in articulation, in all that. But it's always a group proposition. I mean, I went to work with SNCC. SNCC had a lot of leadership. There were a lot of young people. And I mean, John Lewis was the first chairman of SNCC. John was 22 when the March on Washington came, and he was the youngest guy talking at the March on Washington. He was 22 years old. They censored his speech because it was too radical. And, now he's in the Congress. But there was John. There was this Stokely Carmichael. There was Bob Moses. There were a whole lot, and so Dr. King was one among many. And I think it's really to misunderstand the nature of movements to think that, oh, it all depends on this charismatic leader. And even in that case, see, Dr. King was an exemplar of a tradition. It's like he didn't just spring out from under a cabbage somewhere. His dad was a master of preaching, of Baptist preaching, as was his grandfather, as was this whole world in which he grew up. And he was great at it. But he was great at something that there was a whole tradition and a practice and a whole lot of people that were good at it. So I'm just trying to lift up the fact that it isn't all about exceptional individuals. It's about the conditions under which leadership develops. It includes particularly gifted people. But I just, now Cesar is an interesting case because Cesar was a terrible public speaker. I mean, in the early days of the farm worker movement, people used to the sort of iconic Mexican political leader would be somebody big and white and very flourishing with his rhetoric. Lots of very, and people say, "¿Dónde está Chavez?" Point over there. That little guy, that can't be Chavez. He can't even talk. So, there's these stereotypical expectations that are just not so. Cesar's gift was in inspiring a lot of leadership from a lot of people. And so, and I mean, I think Barack's finest rhetorical moments were during the first campaign. I think when he became president, it's sort of like he lost something. And I think there's some really serious, I think he's had some real serious leadership challenges. So I think the whole question of leadership is a little more complicated than that. The importance of narrative and of story and of stories to movements is central. Whether it's a Dr. King, articulating, the I Have a Dream speech. I mean, people forget the first half of that speech was about a nightmare, not a dream. It was a contrast. It was tension. His was a prophetic voice. It wasn't a comforting voice. It was a challenging voice. Kind of forget that. But, whether it's in that form, there's got to be a narrative. There's a story, because what's happening is people are confronting new challenges and needing to find the resources, the moral resources, the courage, the trust in one another to sustain themselves in the face of that challenge. And that's what narrative does. That's why we tell stories. I mean, we're hardwired for it, in fact. Because stories are about, they're all the same, basically. There's a plot, a character, and a moral. That's what makes a story. And a plot, what makes a plot, if I say, I got up this morning and came to Kennedy School, it's not very interesting. I got up this morning, looked outside where my car was supposed to be, and instead there was a big spot there, and I heard a screeching noise on the roof, and I started, talking about, the descent of the Green Dragons in Cambridge, well, whatever. It only gets interesting, a plot becomes interesting when the unexpected intervenes. And that's when we all lean forward, and that's when we pay attention. And so then you sort of have to say, well, why are we all paying attention at that point, even if it's a crazy green dragon or something? Well, the reality is that as human beings, one of the central modes that we experience is having to deal with the unexpected. I mean, because we have this gift of consciousness, because we can anticipate and remember, we experience the plan got screwed up. And our brain has evolved what's called a surveillance system. It detects anomalies. So we're going along, you're driving along, you're on autopilot, in your car, you're driving, and a truck pulls out. Well, it triggers the surveillance system in your brain, and your brain is then saying, truck, 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 truck. And you experience it as anxiety, which then calls your attention and equips you to deal with it. So the basic mechanism for detecting the unexpected, we've evolved. Because we have to, otherwise we keep driving into trucks or the equivalent thereof. Now, the problem is that the default reaction we have to that is fear. The default reaction to anxiety is, I got to run away, or I got to strike out. Now, that may have been functional back in the caveman days. It's not functional when you have to respond to threats as opposed to react to them. In other words, when response requires thought, it requires intentionality. So culturally, we evolved narrative. We evolved storytelling. Because what storytelling does, it enables us to identify with the protagonist of the story. Because we can identify, we experience in the story the challenge, we experience the fear, but we also experience how the protagonist finds hope, how they find confidence, how they are able to deal with it. And because we can identify empathetically with a protagonist in a story, then the stories begin to teach our hearts, not just our heads, where do we go to get hope? Where do we go to get these emotional resources we need to cope with the threat and uncertainty? but so that we're able to respond, not simply react. And those sources turn out to be sources of value for us, because we map the world cognitively, but we also map the world affectively. As we grow up, what inspires us, what's fearful, what's disgusting, and that emotional mapping is really how we understand value. In other words, value is not an intellectual proposition, it's an emotional response. And so we begin to learn that there are sources of hope that we go to, sources of inspiration that we go to. And that's why families and faith traditions all teach through stories. What they're teaching is how to access those resources so we're able to act with agency and not react with fear. And the research on this is like 85% of the time that parents spend with young children storytelling. What are they doing? They're helping us learn how to be choiceful human beings, how to find hope, how to deal with fear. It's not the tactics of it, it's the emotional capacity. That's what stories teach. And that's why everybody tells stories. And sort of what in the work that I do, what we're doing is not really teaching somebody something new. We're enabling people to understand explicitly what they do implicitly, so they can be more intentional and purposeful about it, especially when it comes to leadership, where the narrative, the leadership narrative is a linking of narrative to communicate why I'm called to this leadership role, and what's the challenge that we face, and what are the values we share that can equip us to deal with this challenge. Call it a story of self, a story of us, a story of now. That's kind of a basic construct of how narrative is used in leadership. I think it's important to, first of all, I think it's important to distinguish between hammers and carpenters. And I think the best hammer in the world doesn't build a house. It takes a carpenter to build a house. And I think distinguishing between our tools and us is really important. And technology is just that, technate, it's a tool. And so how we use these tools is a whole lot more important, I think, than the structure of the tools themselves. I mean, they open up new possibilities, but that's the first thing. The power of narrative in particular is its emotional force. A lot of it is visual. See, the science of it, our capacity to tell stories is related to what's called episodic memory, and not all species have episodic memory. They can remember data, but they can't remember events. We can. And it's closely associated to our capacity to visualize, because we're revisualizing those events. Now, the powerful storyteller is a visualizer. A powerful storyteller brings the moment alive. If you think of good storytellers, they take you there. You can see it, you can smell it, you're right there with them, you're in that moment with them. And that's what makes it live. So, what social media can do, it can facilitate communication. I teach this morning we had our launching our 5th year of doing a distance learning class I do with this. We had 119 people in 22 countries I teach organizing with. But we teach it, we use a WebEx platform, but we're teaching real-time synchronous. It's not where people are visible to each other, so it's not like email. It's like creating a space in which people can actually see each other. And the fact they can see each other really makes a huge difference, because then you can enter into relationships and so forth. So it has, but it's also very tricky. The social media as used in Tahrir Square, for example, looked like a really cool thing. Young people using social media, everybody show up at this place this time. The millions of people that in the old days, you couldn't have turned out that number of people without having built an infrastructure of leadership, of coordination, of authority in order to make that happen. You'd make it happen through the social media this time. Well, guess what happened? Who got the benefits of all that mobilization? not the people who did the mobilizing. People got the benefits were the ones with the organization, and that was the Muslim Brothers, and then it was the army. Mobilization is not the same thing as organization, and I think that as these new technologies evolve, we have to really try to understand, yeah, this is pretty cool, but what's the costs over here? And in that case, the ease of mobilization actually wound up in such a way that they didn't do the work of organization. And we see a lot of that right now. Now, it's interesting what's happening in Ukraine right now, but we saw the mobilization in Turkey. Not sure what happened out of that. We saw the mobilization in Brazil. Not sure what happened out of that. So the ease of mobilizing is not the same thing as creating the foundations for social change. So we're learning. That's an exciting time. Are we always going to need to tell stories? Yes. Are they always going to be visual? Yes. Are people going to need to see other people? Yes. And so then the question is sort of what are the different venues and how does that change and so forth. That's what we're learning about now.